It had been weeks in the making, a plan carefully woven together with quiet anticipation and endless scrolling through Pinterest boards for inspiration. A birthday was always something to look forward to, but this year carried more weight than most. It wasn't just a celebration of another year gone by. It was a celebration of endurance, of patience, and of finally feeling settled in the new neighborhood. The house, a modest but cozy place in a suburban cul-de-sac, had finally begun to feel like home. The unpacked boxes were gone. The lawn was trimmed neatly, and the neighbors, well, most of them, had warmed up with small smiles and waves. The idea was simple, a backyard birthday party. Nothing extravagant, nothing wild. Just close friends, a few co-workers, and family members driving in from nearby towns. The backyard wasn't large, but it had the perfect open space for folding tables, a grill, and twinkling string lights that had been tested 3 times to make sure they wouldn't flicker out mid-celebration. A rented bounce house for the kids would keep them entertained, while the adults could relax under the canopy tents, sip drinks, and eat barbecue. The preparations began a week in advance. Grocery lists were checked and rechecked. Balloons were ordered in a soft palette of blues, whites, and golds. The cake, a custom design from a bakery across town, was set to be picked up on the morning of the party. Friends confirmed attendance one by one, promising to bring snacks, extra chairs, and even a cooler filled with sodas. Everything felt like it was falling into place, but behind the excitement, there was always the shadow of one problem. One neighbor who had already made her presence impossible to ignore. Karen. Everyone on the street knew her name, even those who hadn't lived there long. She was the self-appointed enforcer of neighborhood standards, often striding around with her tiny dog in one hand and her phone in the other, as if ready to call someone, anyone, at the faintest sign of joy. She had already left a passive-aggressive note about recycling bins being left on the curb a little too long, and she had made a fuss when someone's guest parked along the sidewalk. Her reputation preceded her. In the weeks leading up to the party, there had been a gnawing thought. Would Karen cause trouble? The party was, after all, planned to last into the evening, with music, laughter, and the possibility of a few cars parked on the street. It wasn't a rager, but it was certainly more activity than the neighborhood was used to. Despite the worry, optimism won out. Surely, for one evening, she could let it slide. Surely, a birthday wasn't too much to ask. The morning of the party arrived crisp and sunny. Decorations went up, tables were arranged, and the grill was set in place. The bounce house crew arrived right on time, inflating the colorful structure that immediately drew cheers from the children already gathering on the lawn. The smell of charcoal and marinated chicken soon followed, wafting through the air and attracting curious glances from neighbors peeking through their blinds. Friends began to arrive, carrying platters of food, gifts wrapped in shiny paper, and bottles of soda that clinked together as they were set on the table. There was a hum of chatter, the kind of warm buzz that made the heart swell. The birthday was shaping up perfectly. And then, just as the first round of burgers was flipped on the grill, she appeared. Karen. She emerged from her pristine house across the street, her posture rigid, her expression sharp. Her little dog trotted beside her, yapping as though echoing her discontent. Karen stopped at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the scene like a hawk sizing up prey. The partygoers noticed. Conversations faltered slightly. Eyes darted toward her, and a quiet ripple of unease spread through the group. But no one said anything. After all, this wasn't her property. This wasn't her event. It wasn't her business. Still, the sense of impending conflict hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. She lingered there, watching, her lips pressed into a thin line. Eventually, she disappeared back into her house, leaving behind only speculation. For a while, It seemed she might just keep her opinions to herself. The party carried on. Music played softly through a speaker. Kids bounced gleefully in the inflatable castle, and laughter mingled with the crackle of the grill. The birthday cake arrived safely, perfectly frosted with a golden shimmer, drawing gasps of admiration. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Lanterns flickered to life, casting a gentle glow across the backyard. The celebration was reaching its peak, with everyone gathered in small groups, sharing stories and enjoying the food. And then it happened. The unmistakable sound of a phone call, made just loud enough for others to hear. Karen had stepped back outside, phone pressed to her ear, pacing along the sidewalk with exaggerated movements. Though her words weren't entirely clear, fragments carried across the street. Words like disturbance, noise, and unreasonable. The pit in the stomach returned. She was calling someone, and given her reputation, there was little doubt about who that someone was. The partygoers exchanged uneasy looks. Parents glanced toward their children in the bounce house, calculating whether they'd have to leave sooner than planned. The once light-hearted atmosphere grew heavy with tension, as if everyone were collectively holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Minutes stretched on like hours. The music was turned down slightly. Conversations dropped to a lower murmur, and even the children's laughter seemed muted. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, the flashing lights of a patrol car, or the stern voice of some official sent to break up what was, in reality, a harmless birthday gathering. The host's heart raced. After all the planning, all the effort, could it really come to this? Would one person's discontent overshadow an evening meant to celebrate joy and togetherness? As the sky grew darker and the first stars appeared, the mood teetered on the edge of unraveling completely. And just as it seemed the night might collapse under the weight of her interference, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A car slowly approached, its lights washing over the carefully arranged decorations and the gathering of friends and family. The tension tightened like a knot. This was it. Karen's call had summoned someone, and whatever happened next would decide the fate of the entire evening. The car came to a stop, directly in front of the house. The door opened, and a figure stepped out, casting a long shadow across the lawn. The birthday party was about to face its first real test. The figure that stepped out of the car carried an unmistakable air of authority, though not in uniform. It wasn't a patrol officer or some code enforcement official, as everyone had feared. It was the head of the neighborhood's homeowners association. His car, polished to a gleaming shine, reflected the string lights draped across the yard. His neatly pressed polo shirt bore the HOA logo, a reminder of the group that many residents tolerated but rarely praised. He walked with deliberate slowness, scanning the decorations, the tables of food, and the people gathered in quiet anticipation. Karen followed closely behind, her little dog tugging at its leash, as if trying to punctuate her urgency. She looked smug, her face carrying the satisfaction of someone convinced they had won a battle before it had even begun. The host's heart sank. It wasn't the police, but sometimes an HOA representative could be worse. They had rules, pages of them, about noise, gatherings, and what was deemed acceptable for the community. And while most people lived comfortably without issue, Karen had proven time and again that she knew every single rule by heart and wasn't afraid to wield them like weapons. The music was switched off entirely now, leaving an unnatural silence. The children, sensing the shift, slowed their bouncing in the inflatable castle, peeking out with curious eyes. Guests shuffled uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, others looking toward the host as if waiting for instructions. The HOA representative cleared his throat, loud enough to command attention. He adjusted his watch, glanced at Karen, and then began his slow circuit around the yard, taking in every detail as though conducting an inspection. The smell of barbecue still lingered in the air, but it felt less inviting now, almost accusatory, as though it too might be used as evidence. Karen's satisfaction grew with every passing second. Her arms were folded, her chin tilted slightly upward, her body language screaming triumph. She was the one who had made the call, and now she stood ready to bask in the glory of being right. The host's mind raced. Had they overlooked something? Was the gathering technically against some obscure clause? The invitations had been private, the music wasn't blasting, and it wasn't past quiet hours. Still, the possibility loomed. The HOA representative finally spoke, though his tone was measured and calm. He mentioned that a complaint had been received about a disruptive gathering and excessive activity. He gestured vaguely toward the yard, the decorations, and the bounce house. His words weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of official scrutiny. Karen leaned forward slightly, almost eager, as if waiting for him to drop the hammer and declare the party unlawful. She gave subtle nods with every word he spoke, her satisfaction radiating like a beacon. Guests exchanged nervous glances, and some began quietly collecting their belongings, preparing to leave early if things turned sour. The bounce house sagged slightly, as a few children climbed out, their fun interrupted by the weight of grown-up conflict they couldn't quite understand. But then, something shifted. The HOA representative walked closer to the tables, where plates of food were arranged neatly, where drinks were tucked into coolers, and where the birthday cake sat in all its golden frosted glory. He asked about the occasion, and the host explained simply, a birthday celebration. For a moment, there was silence. Karen's smugness faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as if trying to read the situation. The representative nodded slowly. Glancing around once more, he noted that the party wasn't spilling into the street, that the music wasn't unreasonably loud, and that no driveways were being blocked. In fact, by all visible measures, the gathering was completely reasonable. Karen's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. She interjected quickly, pointing toward the bounce house, muttering about safety concerns and community standards. She gestured toward the number of cars parked along the street, claiming it created congestion. Her voice grew sharper, her frustration more apparent with each passing second. But the HOA representative remained calm. He acknowledged her concerns, but repeated that nothing appeared out of line. He emphasized that it was a personal celebration, not a recurring event, and therefore posed no violation worth enforcing. A ripple of relief spread through the guests, though it was cautious. Karen, however, was not ready to accept defeat. She pressed harder, her words tumbling out in rapid succession, her face reddening as she tried to escalate her argument. She spoke of respect for the neighborhood, of standards slipping, of how things would get out of control if rules weren't followed to the letter. Her voice grew louder, enough that people began whispering and watching, the tension once again shifting. What had been an attempt to control the situation now teetered dangerously close to becoming a spectacle. The HOA representative finally raised a hand, stopping her mid-rant. His voice was calm but firm, making it clear the conversation was over. The party was allowed to continue. The host and their guests were not in violation of any rules. Karen froze, her lips parting in disbelief. She looked around expecting someone, anyone to support her. But the silence of the guests, the polite nods of approval toward the representative, and even the soft laughter of children back in the bounce house confirmed the truth. She had failed. Her face flushed crimson as she stood there, her dog barking sharply at the growing awkwardness of the moment. For the first time, her authority had not only been challenged, but dismantled publicly. Unable to gather herself, she turned abruptly and stormed back to her house, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. Her dog scurried to keep up, yapping all the way, as if mocking her failed crusade. The HOA representative gave a polite nod, wished the host a happy birthday, and walked back to his car. As his taillights disappeared down the street, a collective exhale spread through the party. Music slowly returned. Laughter bubbled back up, and the night seemed to right itself once more. But the memory of Karen's red face, her sharp words crumbling into silence, lingered like an aftertaste. The party carried on into the evening. The air filled again with warmth and celebration, yet beneath it all was the undeniable knowledge that this wasn't over. Karen had lost the battle, but her pride was wounded, and pride rarely healed quietly. She would be back. The party had survived the first storm, but no one could shake the uneasy feeling that lingered even after Karen's retreat. For the rest of the evening, there was laughter, music, and joy, but it was shadowed by the knowledge that she was only a few steps away, seething in her house, her blinds surely pulled just enough for her to peer out. Guests whispered about it in hushed tones. Parents chuckled nervously, joking about how every neighborhood seemed to have one of those people, while others admitted they half expected her to return with another complaint before the night ended. The host reassured everyone, reminding them that the HOA representative had made it clear the party wasn't breaking any rules. That should have been enough, but for someone like Karen, it wasn't. From behind her windows, she watched. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the children bouncing again, of people chatting comfortably on folding chairs, of the cake being sliced and shared. Every burst of laughter that drifted toward her house felt like an insult. She had called in reinforcements, and they had dismissed her. She had been humiliated in front of neighbors and strangers alike, and humiliation, to her, was unforgivable. The night carried on peacefully enough, and when the last guest departed with warm goodbyes, the host finally allowed themselves to relax. Cleanup was left for the morning, and as the string lights dimmed, the house grew quiet. The party was a success, despite everything, but the next morning brought a reminder that success always comes with consequences. When the host stepped outside to gather trash bags and deflate the bounce house, a slip of paper fluttered against the door. At first, it seemed like a misplaced flyer, but upon closer inspection, it was worse. It was a letter. A complaint, written in neat but sharp handwriting, tucked into an envelope with no return address, but unmistakably from Karen. The letter was long, filled with accusations, noise well past acceptable hours, suspicious behavior from guests, alleged parking violations, and even concerns about safety hazards posed by the bounce house. Each claim was exaggerated, twisted, or outright false, designed not just to criticize, but to document, to build a case. At the bottom, it ended with a chilling line: "Further infractions will not be tolerated." The host sighed, folding the letter and placing it on the counter inside. It was ridiculous, almost laughable, but there was no denying the intent behind it. This wasn't over. The following days proved that point all too well. Karen began her campaign of revenge with small calculated moves. She made calls, lots of them. Delivery drivers showed up with orders no one had placed, blocking the driveway and creating unnecessary hassle. Packages went missing, only to mysteriously reappear on the porch days later. Trash cans were mysteriously tipped over, their contents spilled onto the lawn. Neighbors noticed too. Some admitted quietly that she had approached them, warning about the disruptive family who had hosted that wild party. She tried to sway them, planting seeds of distrust, hoping to turn the community against the host. But the most obvious act came at night. More than once, the host caught the faint glimmer of a flashlight beam moving across the backyard fence. Karen was watching, searching for any sign of another infraction she could report. The thought of her lurking in the shadows cataloging perceived offenses, sent shivers through the household. The host tried to ignore it, brushing off her antics as petty and desperate. But the tension built like pressure in a sealed jar. Something was bound to give. The breaking point came the following weekend. Determined not to let Karen control their life, the host invited a few friends over for a quiet evening. Nothing like the birthday party. Just a small dinner, soft music, and casual conversation. But even that was enough to set her off. Halfway through the evening, a sudden blast of light illuminated the backyard. The harsh beam of a spotlight cut through the dark, blinding the guests and casting sharp shadows across the lawn. Karen had positioned herself in her driveway with a massive floodlight pointed directly at the gathering. She stood there, arms crossed, daring anyone to challenge her. The guests were stunned. Some shielded their eyes. Others laughed nervously. But all of them recognized it for what it was. A power play. Karen wasn't just watching now. She was actively interfering, trying to ruin what little peace the host had managed to reclaim. It didn't stop there. She pulled out her phone, taking photos and videos, narrating loudly about illegal activity and evidence for the HOA. Her voice carried through the night, sharp and grating. Her words designed not just to document, but to shame. The host's patience snapped. This wasn't just about one party anymore. It was harassment, intimidation, a relentless attempt to control not just what happened in her own yard, but what happened in everyone else's lives. The guests encouraged the host to stand firm, to document everything in return. Phones came out, photos were taken of Karen's spotlight stunt, and her voice, dripping with venom, was captured in videos. What she thought would be her victory was, in fact, evidence of her obsession. Eventually, Karen retreated, muttering angrily as she dragged her floodlight back inside. But the damage was done. Her actions had crossed a line, and this time, there was proof. The host realized that waiting for her to stop wasn't enough. Karen thrived on control, and as long as she believed she could manipulate the situation, she would never let go. It was time to turn the tables, to prepare for a confrontation that couldn't be avoided forever, because while Karen had spent her days plotting revenge, the hosts now had a plan of their own. And unlike Karen's, it didn't rely on lies, intimidation, or pettiness. It relied on the truth. The battle lines were drawn, and the neighborhood was about to witness a showdown unlike anything it had seen before. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but beneath that calm, something was brewing. Karen kept to her usual patterns, walking her dog at precisely the same times, lingering too long at the edges of driveways, pretending to be absorbed in her phone while her eyes darted toward the host's house. She was watching, waiting, convinced that another slip-up would hand her the upper hand. But this time, she wasn't the only one documenting. The host, tired of living under constant scrutiny, had begun to gather evidence of their own. Every strange delivery, every tipped-over trash can, every flashlight beam slicing through the night was recorded. Screenshots were saved, videos were filed, and photos were catalogued. What Karen thought of as subtle harassment was being turned into a trail of undeniable proof. At the same time, the host started reaching out to neighbors. It began with casual conversations, small talk at mailboxes, friendly chats during evening walks. The story unfolded piece by piece, always careful, always factual. People were reminded of the birthday party, of Karen's dramatic spotlight stunt, of her attempts to spin harmless gatherings into violations. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Neighbors admitted that Karen had knocked on their doors too, complaining about one thing or another. Some laughed about how she had warned them of declining standards because of Halloween decorations. Others confessed she had tried to rally them against the host, spinning tales of noise and disruption. What she didn't realize was that people were growing tired of her constant meddling. It became clear that Karen wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was suffocating it. The host listened, collected their stories, and encouraged them to speak up. A picture was forming, one that no amount of Karen's complaints could erase. The opportunity to turn that picture into action came sooner than expected. The HOA scheduled its monthly meeting, an event usually sparsely attended. Few people bothered to show up, as the meetings often dragged on with discussions about lawn care, minor repairs, and budget allocations. But this time there was buzz. Word had spread about Karen's spotlight stunt, about her letter-writing campaign, about her crusade against a birthday party. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet were now curious, some even eager to see what would happen. The night of the meeting, the community center parking lot filled more than usual. People trickled in, chatting in low voices, some carrying printouts, others scrolling through their phones with photos and messages ready. Karen arrived early, of course, dressed sharply, clutching a binder so thick it looked like it contained years of grievances. She greeted a few neighbors with stiff nods, her confidence radiating as though she had already secured victory. She had no idea what was coming. When the meeting began, the usual topics were covered first: maintenance updates, budget notes, landscaping contracts. Karen sat impatiently, tapping her pen, waiting for her chance to speak. When the floor opened for community concerns, she pounced. She launched into a polished speech about disturbances, declining neighborhood standards, and repeated violations. She waved her binder like a weapon, pointing toward the host and accusing them of disrespecting the community with their parties, their guests, and their so-called reckless behavior. For a while, the room was silent. Karen had spoken with such conviction, such volume, that it seemed she might once again dominate the narrative. Her words dripped with authority, rehearsed and sharpened like blades. But then, the shift came. A neighbor stood up, calmly but firmly, and recounted the night of the birthday party, not as a disruption, but as a joyful, reasonable gathering. They described Karen's spotlight stunt, how she had aimed it at guests, how she had taken photos, and shouted accusations into the night. Another neighbor followed, sharing how Karen had harassed them with complaints about decorations. Yet another spoke of packages that mysteriously disappeared and reappeared, hinting at her pattern of behavior. Voices multiplied. One by one, neighbors shared their experiences, their frustrations, their exhaustion with Karen's constant meddling. What had once been whispered in private was now spoken aloud. In front of the very board she had counted on for support, the host remained calm, offering only the evidence they had collected. Videos of the spotlight, photos of notes left at the door, screenshots of false complaints. They didn't need to embellish. The truth was damning enough. Karen's face reddened as the room shifted against her. She tried to interject, raising her voice, accusing others of exaggeration, but each outburst only weakened her position. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't about community standards. It was about control. The HOA board, usually cautious and measured, couldn't ignore the wave of testimony. They listened, they reviewed the evidence, and for once, they didn't side with her. Instead, they made it clear that harassment and intimidation would not be tolerated. Any further complaints would need substantial proof, and weaponizing the HOA's rules for personal vendettas would carry consequences. The room buzzed with quiet satisfaction. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks. Some even clapped softly when the decision was announced. For the first time, Karen wasn't the authority in the room. She was the one being warned. Her expression was priceless. The confidence drained from her face, replaced by shock, then fury. She clutched her binder tightly, her knuckles white, as though the weight of it could somehow shield her from the reality crashing down around her. When the meeting adjourned, she stormed out without a word, her heels echoing down the hallway. The binder thudded against her side. Useless now. Its contents nothing more than pages of complaints no one wanted to hear. For the host and the neighbors, it was a victory, a turning point. Karen had been publicly challenged and publicly defeated. But even in triumph, one thought lingered. Karen wasn't the kind of person to let go easily. Public embarrassment would only fuel her fire. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Karen had never tasted humiliation quite like this. For years, she had been the one people tiptoed around, the unspoken authority of the cul-de-sac. She prided herself on keeping things in order, and though many resented her, few dared to stand against her. But now, the facade had cracked. The HOA had dismissed her binder of grievances. Her neighbors had spoken out, and the host she despised had walked away from the meeting, not defeated, but vindicated. It festered inside her like a wound she couldn't stop picking at. Every glance from a neighbor, every hint of laughter she overheard, felt like mockery. She imagined them talking about her behind closed doors, repeating stories of the spotlight incident, mimicking her rants, reveling in her downfall. The thought consumed her. She told herself she wasn't beaten. She couldn't be. Not by them. In the days after the meeting, Karen doubled down on her efforts. She began filing complaint after complaint, not just against the host, but against anyone who had dared speak against her. Lawn too long, reported. Trash can out too early, reported. Kids riding bikes without helmets, reported. She flooded the HOA and even city offices with calls and emails, determined to drown her enemies in red tape. But the complaints were weaker now, more desperate. The HOA, having already heard the stories, no longer rushed to her defense. Her calls were logged, acknowledged, and quietly set aside. Even the city workers grew weary of her constant accusations. She was becoming noise, background static too repetitive to take seriously. Her anger grew. One night, under the cover of darkness, she tried something bolder. Armed with a camera and a notepad, she crept toward the host's property. Determined to catch them in some violation, she circled the fence line, crouched low, snapping photos of the backyard as though she might uncover some hidden offense. But what she didn't know was that she herself was being watched. Security cameras caught every move. Her flashlight beam, her pacing, her phone snapping pictures. What she thought of as evidence gathering was in reality trespassing. The host didn't confront her then. They didn't need to. They simply saved the footage, added it to the growing archive of her behavior, and waited. Meanwhile, Karen's desperation spilled into the open. She began accosting neighbors in the street, demanding to know why they had turned on her. She accused them of conspiring against her, of plotting to ruin the neighborhood. People stopped answering their doors when she knocked. Conversations died when she approached. Where once her presence commanded unease, now it inspired eye rolls and muttered insults. But still, she wasn't finished. The final straw came when she tried to organize her own neighborhood watch meeting. She went door to door with flyers, declaring that the HOA had failed, that standards were slipping, and that she would take charge. Few answered, fewer agreed, and when the night of the meeting arrived, she sat alone in her living room, chairs set out, a presentation ready on her laptop, empty, save for the loyal yapping of her dog. The humiliation was complete, but she couldn't admit it. Instead, she looked for one last way to strike back, something so bold it would put her back in control. That chance came when the host announced, quietly but proudly, that they would be hosting a neighborhood barbecue. It wasn't a massive event, just a way to thank the neighbors for their support during the chaos. The invitations were handwritten, warm and simple, and nearly everyone agreed to come. To Karen, it was salt in the wound. Not only had they survived her attempts to destroy them, they were thriving. They were winning people over, turning her own battlefield into their victory parade. She couldn't allow it. On the day of the barbecue, Karen prepared her most dramatic move yet. She called city code enforcement, animal control, and even the fire department, spinning stories of overcrowding, unsafe cooking equipment, and hazardous conditions. She rehearsed what she would say when officials arrived, picturing herself standing triumphantly as the party was shut down, the host's face crumbling in defeat. When the event began, she positioned herself on her porch, binder in hand, waiting. She watched as neighbors gathered in the host's backyard, as the smell of grilled food filled the air, as laughter rose above the fences. Her dog barked beside her, agitated by her tense energy. Then, in the distance, she saw the flashing lights. A fire truck, followed by a city vehicle, slowly rolled down the street. Karen's heart leapt. This was it, the moment she would reclaim her authority. She straightened her shoulders, ready to step forward and lead the charge. But she miscalculated, because while she believed the host was unprepared, they had already anticipated her next move. They had seen the pattern, recorded the harassment, and warned the necessary departments ahead of time. When the officials arrived, they weren't there to shut down a barbecue. They were there with context. They were there with knowledge. And they were there with cameras rolling, thanks to the neighbors who had gathered evidence of their own. Karen, binder in hand, rushed to meet them. She launched into her speech, voice shrill with conviction, accusing the host of every violation she could imagine. She gestured wildly, pointing toward the backyard, insisting the entire event was unsafe. Her words tumbled out, louder and faster, desperate to convince. But the officials didn't rush past her toward the yard. They stopped, listened, and then calmly explained that they had already spoken with the host, that everything was in order, and that her constant complaints had been noted. The fire crew checked the grill, nodded, and confirmed it was safe. The city inspector glanced around, found no issues, and quietly recorded her behavior instead. The silence that followed was deafening. Neighbors, gathered nearby, watched as her tirade crumbled into sputters and stammers. Phones were out, recording the entire exchange. Karen, once the feared enforcer, now stood exposed, red-faced, ranting, and powerless. Her binder clutched like a shield that no longer mattered. The humiliation was no longer private. It was public, and this time it was unforgettable. The barbecue carried on, laughter and music filling the air. But the true entertainment had unfolded at the front of the street. Karen, red-faced and sputtering, had been caught in the act of her own undoing. The officials, patient but firm, made their final notes and left without issuing so much as a warning. The fire truck's siren wailed once as it rolled away, a farewell that felt more like a victory parade than an emergency response. The neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, returned to the yard with renewed energy. They laughed openly now, not in cruel mockery, but in the shared release of years of tension. Karen had always loomed over them like a storm cloud, unpredictable and controlling. But now, under the soft glow of string lights and the hum of conversation, she looked smaller than ever, powerless, outnumbered, and undone by her own obsession. From her porch, she lingered, binder clutched tightly against her chest. Her dog barked wildly, feeding off her agitation, but she didn't move. She stood frozen as phone cameras recorded, as whispers spread, as the hosts themselves walked calmly back into their yard, not a trace of fear or defeat in their posture. For once, Karen wasn't the center of control. She was the cautionary tale. The host, without needing to utter a word, had won. Their patience, their documentation, their refusal to stoop to her level had paid off. Karen had been exposed not by loud arguments or angry confrontations, but by her own relentless need to dominate. She had written her downfall into every letter, every complaint, every spotlight stunt. As the night wore on, the barbecue became more than a party. It became a celebration of freedom. Neighbors, who had once kept their distance, began forging connections, swapping stories of Karen's antics, laughing at memories that had once been sources of stress. Plates of food were passed around, children played freely, and the atmosphere was one of solidarity. For the first time, the neighborhood felt united, not under Karen's watchful eye, but in spite of it. Karen eventually retreated inside, slamming her door hard enough for everyone to hear. But instead of intimidation, the sound brought relief. It was the sound of defeat. In the days that followed, the shift was undeniable. The footage of her tirade made its rounds, passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor, until nearly everyone had seen her binder-waving meltdown. People no longer avoided her out of fear. They avoided her out of disdain. Conversations that once hushed at her approach now carried on as if she weren't there at all. Her reign of control had ended, not with a single blow, but with the slow erosion of credibility, until nothing was left. The HOA, too, had seen enough. A letter was circulated to the community, reminding residents of proper conduct, not just in following rules, but in respecting neighbors. Though her name was never mentioned, everyone knew who it was about. It was a quiet, bureaucratic way of saying what everyone else was already thinking. Karen had gone too far. For the host, life settled back into normalcy. There were no more mysterious letters on the door, no more spotlights or flashlights in the night. Packages stayed where they belonged. Trash cans remained upright, and the cul-de-sac no longer felt like a battleground. But the most satisfying part wasn't peace. It was the sense of victory, the knowledge that Karen's own arrogance had undone her. The birthday party she had tried so hard to ruin had become the spark that rallied an entire community, and her attempt at revenge had only magnified her embarrassment. Months later, when birthdays came around again, the host planned another gathering. This time, it wasn't just friends and family. It was the whole neighborhood. Invitations were met with excitement, not hesitation. Tables lined the street, music played, and laughter echoed into the night. It was bigger, brighter, and louder than before, and yet no one complained. Because this time, Karen didn't show her face. Her blinds remained closed, her porch empty. The only sound from her house was the muffled barking of her dog, drowned out by the joy she could no longer control. The party stretched long into the evening, a living reminder that community isn't built on fear or control. It's built on laughter, connection, and standing together against those who try to break it apart. And though Karen would always be remembered as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, her story had become less about her power and more about her downfall. A downfall she had orchestrated herself, with every complaint, every spotlight, every desperate attempt to win. In the end, she didn't just fail to shut down a birthday party. She shut down her own authority, and the neighborhood never looked back.